The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is no longer governing. He is malfunctioning on live television. Keir Starmer just stood at the dispatch box, opened his mouth to speak, and produced a silence so profound, so terrifyingly hollow, that it instantly became the obituary of his administration. This was not a pause for thought. This was not a technical difficulty. This was the precise millisecond where the weight of a failing system crushed a man in real time. Cabinet ministers are staring at their shoes. The opposition is screaming for a division. The speaker is shouting for order in a chamber that has dissolved into absolute bedlam. If you want to witness the moment the British political establishment finally snapped, subscribe now, because the footage emerging from Westminster is going to change the history of this nation forever. It began at 12:04 p.m., during what was supposed to be a routine defense of the budget. The House was volatile, simmering with the kind of aggression that usually precedes a riot. But nobody expected the psychological collapse of a sitting prime minister. A question was launched from the backbenches, a sharp, piercing inquiry about the hidden costs of the latest energy mandates. Starmer rose. He gripped the wood of the box. He looked up at the opposition benches. And then he simply stopped. His eyes glazed over. His jaw tightened. The air left the room. For 7 seconds, there was noise. Then, for 20 agonizing seconds, there was a silence that screamed.
He looked down at his notes, but he wasn't reading them. He was staring through them. It was the look of a man who realizes the game is up, the look of a captain watching the water breach the final bulkhead. Behind him, Angela Rayner leaned forward, whispering frantically, her hand hovering near his elbow, unsure if she should touch him or distance herself from the blast radius. Rachel Reeves turned pale, her eyes darting to the press gallery, knowing the cameras were capturing every micro-expression of panic. The Prime Minister's mouth opened again, but no sound came out, just a dry rattle of breath. The House of Commons, usually a pit of jeers and noise, fell into a stunned, visceral quiet. It was the sound of 650 people realizing they were watching a nervous breakdown broadcast to the nation. Then the dam broke. A single shout of "Resign!" pierced the air, and suddenly the chamber exploded. The speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, was on his feet, his face red with exertion, bellowing for order, but his authority had evaporated. The Prime Minister stood frozen amidst the sonic warfare, a statue of failure in a room on fire. He didn't sit down, he didn't drink water, he just stood there, paralyzed by a truth he could no longer outrun. This wasn't politics. This was a physiological rejection of the lie he had been living. And as the live feed was cut to a wide angle to hide his face, the nation knew. The government had fallen. They just hadn't signed the paperwork yet.
But the paralysis inside the chamber was nothing compared to the shockwave hitting the corridors of power. As the Prime Minister was finally ushered out of the chamber by aides who looked more like paramedics than political advisors, the machinery of the state began to cannibalize itself. Whips were seen running toward the private offices, phones pressed to their ears, shouting instructions that nobody was following. The illusion of control had shattered. Backbench Labour MPs were huddling in corners, checking their majorities on their phones, realizing that the man who had just frozen at the dispatch box had just dragged their careers down with him. The atmosphere in the tea room was described by one insider as funeral parlor meets active war zone. They knew the footage was already circling the globe. Washington was watching. Beijing was watching. The weakness was exposed. Within 30 minutes, the narrative had shifted from a bad performance to a question of medical and mental fitness to lead. But it was worse than that. Sources inside the terrifyingly quiet halls of Number 10 confirmed that the freeze wasn't random. It was triggered. Just minutes before entering the chamber, Starmer had been handed a briefing, a single sheet of paper with red classification borders.
What was on that paper? Why did the Prime Minister's hands shake when he held it? And why did 3 senior security officials enter Downing Street through the rear entrance, while the Prime Minister was still standing frozen in Parliament? The speculation was rampant, but the fear was specific. This was the behavior of an administration that had hit a wall it could not climb. The media began to circle like sharks smelling blood in the water. BBC political editors, usually so careful to maintain the veneer of stability, were using words like catastrophic and terminal. The 24-hour news cycle went into hyperdrive. Every slow-motion replay of Starmer's vacant stare stripped away another layer of his authority. It was the image of a man who had seen the ghost of his own political death. And the British people, watching from living rooms and offices, felt a collective shiver. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the terrifying realization that there was nobody at the wheel. The cockpit was empty, the plane was diving, and the ground was coming up fast.
The reaction outside the Westminster bubble was immediate, ferocious, and total. This wasn't just a Westminster Village story. This was a national emergency. Within an hour of the broadcast, crowds began to materialize on Parliament Square. They didn't wait for organizers. They didn't wait for permission. They just came, driven by an instinctual sense that the social contract had been breached. The noise of the crowd began to penetrate the thick stone walls of the Palace of Westminster. Not fit to lead. Get him out. The chants were rhythmic, heavy, a drumbeat of public fury. But the real devastation was happening on the screens of the City of London. The markets do not like vacuums, and Britain now had a black hole where its leadership used to be. The pound sterling took a nosedive, shedding value with terrifying speed as algorithms read the instability and dumped UK assets. Gilt yields spiked. The cost of government borrowing surged in minutes, adding billions to the national debt before the Prime Minister had even made it back to Downing Street.
In the frantic offices of the Treasury, civil servants were watching their monitors with heads in their hands. They saw the confidence of the world evaporating. A senior banker at a major investment firm was quoted saying, "Britain is currently uninvestable. We don't know who was in charge, and based on what we just saw, neither do they." This was the verdict of the world's money. It was brutal, unsentimental, and devastatingly accurate. The chaos spilled into the streets of Whitehall. Police vans with lights flashing screamed down the embankment, trying to secure the perimeter around Downing Street, but the crowd was swelling too fast. It was a mix of everyone, left, right, young, old, united by a singular, horrifying clarity. The government had ceased to function. Inside Number 10, the bunker mentality had taken hold. Junior staffers were reportedly in tears. Senior advisors were locking doors. The Prime Minister was nowhere to be seen. He had retreated to the residence, isolating himself from the very cabinet ministers demanding answers. It was a siege, and the besiegers were the British people.
But the true escalation, the moment this crisis crossed the line from political disaster to constitutional nightmare, happened when the red boxes stopped moving. Reports began to leak that the civil service, the permanent bureaucracy that runs the country, was effectively downing tools. Permanent secretaries were holding emergency meetings, discussing whether any order coming from the Prime Minister could be considered lawful given his incapacitated state. This is the stuff of failed states. This is the moment a democracy teeters on the edge. And amidst this carnage, a single black car left the gates of Buckingham Palace. It was an unmarked Jaguar, flanked by royalty protection officers, moving with a speed and aggression that signaled this was not a ceremonial journey. The king was not watching on television. The king was entering the arena. For decades, the monarchy has stayed above the fray, a silent observer of political squabbles. But silence was no longer an option. The crown has a duty to ensure the government functions, and the government was clearly broken. The king was being dragged into a late-night power clash that he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid.
The destination of the royal convoy was not Downing Street. That would be too public, too inflammatory. Instead, the convoy headed for a discreet location in Knightsbridge, a private residence used for off-the-books diplomacy.
At the same time, a separate convoy left the back of Downing Street. Keir Starmer, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 hours, was huddled in the back of a Range Rover, heading to the same location. The King and the Prime Minister were about to meet in the shadows. This was not the weekly audience. This was a crisis intervention. Constitutional scholars were already dusting off obscure texts from the 19th century. Does the king have the power to dismiss a prime minister who is physically present but mentally absent? Can the monarch intervene when the market is crashing and the streets are filling? The answer is a terrifying maybe, and that ambiguity is where the danger lies. As the two men met, away from the cameras, the fate of the nation hung on the conversation. Sources close to the palace described the king's mood as icily furious. He was not there to offer comfort. He was there to demand stability. He was there to ask the question that nobody else could ask. Sir, can you command the confidence of this kingdom? Starmer's answer to that question is lost to history, but the result was written on his face when he emerged at 1:15 a.m. He looked shattered, hollowed out, a husk of a politician. He didn't return to Downing Street. He went to his private home in North London. The symbolism was unmistakable. He had abandoned the seat of power. Meanwhile, the palace issued a statement so brief, so cold, that it sent a chill through the entire political class. His Majesty remains in close contact with all relevant authorities to ensure the continuity of governance. Continuity. That was the key word. It implied that continuity was under threat. It implied that the crown was stepping in to hold the beams of the house together while the foundation crumbled. The king had been forced to act as the backstop to a failed premiership. It was a humiliation for Starmer, but a tragedy for the Constitution. The line between crown and parliament had been blurred because the parliament had failed to do its job.
By dawn, the landscape of British politics had been scorched. The Prime Minister was technically still in office, but he was no longer in power. Power had bled out of him on the floor of the House of Commons and pooled in the streets, in the markets, and in the private rooms of the palace. The cabinet was in open revolt. Letters of no confidence were flying into the 1922 committee, and the Labour executive with the speed of a machine gun. The sharks were not just circling, they were feeding. The acting opposition leader called a press conference at 6 a.m., standing in front of a sea of Union Jacks, declaring that the government had forfeited the right to govern. It was a statement of fact. The country was waking up to a zombie government, led by a ghost, overseen by a worried king. The sense of unease was palpable. People walked to work checking their phones, waiting for the notification that would tell them it was over. But the notification didn't come. The stalemate continued. A paralyzed leader, a furious public, a nervous monarch. This is the most dangerous moment in recent history. We are in uncharted waters without a map or a captain. The freeze at the dispatch box was the signal. The crash in the markets was the symptom. The king's intervention was the desperate remedy. But the disease is deep. The system that allowed a man to break in front of the world and still cling to office is a system that is rotting from the inside out. The question is not just whether Starmer survives the day. He won't. The question is what rises from the ashes of this collapse. Will it be a restoration of order or a descent into total chaos? The people are watching. The establishment is trembling. And the silence that started in Parliament is about to be broken by the roar of a nation demanding change. This isn't over. The real crisis is just beginning. Who knew about the briefing paper? Who sent the security officials? And what did the king truly say in that room? The truth is coming,